Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and good evening, good morning, wherever you find yourself in the world. Thank you for joining us for the 8th installment of the Post 2020 webinar, the last one for 2019. We're very excited to have you guys join us. My name is Ryan Fisher from the Cities Biodiversity Center in the ICLEI Africa office. I'll be moderating the session today. And the panelists who will be speaking to us today is Mr. Oliver Gelel from the SCBD. Ms. Ingrid Cossier, who's with me in the office, so we'll be sharing a laptop. So please don't be alarmed if you hear a female's voice and with my name. And then Ms. Wendy Yap, who joined us for this morning session. So she was unfortunately not able to join us this afternoon, but we will play a recording of her talk from this morning in her slot. And then we have Ms. Larissa Heinisch from Biodiversity and Resilience Coordinator at ICLEI South America office. So thank you to everyone for joining us. Thank you for the panelists for availing themselves for this last webinar of the year. And the general theme of today is just a general report back, primarily on some of most recent relevant events, most notably so the event or the 23rd installment of the subsidiary body on scientific, technical, and technological advice or advisory, and that will be led by Mr. Oliver, and he's actually our first speaker. So before we get into the first presentation, just to note that we will have the presentations concurrently, which after we'll have a question and discussions opportunities after that. The webinar and the presentations will also be made available to all participants. So the webinar is being recorded, so you can expect to receive that post the webinar, and presentations will be shared as well. So after all the presentations has been concluded, you will have the opportunity to raise your hand. You should see that option next to your name. There's that option to raise your hand if you want to ask a question, or you are more than welcome to use the questions and chat functions as well. So I hope everybody can hear me and we're audible. And I'm gonna, without further ado, hand over to Oliver to just give us some feedback on the latest SAPSTA meeting. So Oliver, over to you.
Thank you very much, Ryan. And thank you all for participating in this webinar. My role today is to share with you some of the outcomes of the 23rd meeting of the subsidiary body on scientific, technical, and technological advice, SBSTA 23. This is a meeting of delegates from the 196 parties who are charged with everything related to science, to the scientific base upon which the decisions in the convention are taken. So this meeting in this particular occasion in Montreal looked into the issues that are on that screen. Climate change, nature and culture, very interesting cooperation with UNESCO. The ecologically and biologically significant areas beyond national jurisdiction in the seas was an interesting issue, which is very much connected to the constituency of this call, subnational and local governments, in the sense that many of the overseas territories and islands of many of the parties, in fact, and many of the islands have many interests on large marine areas beyond national jurisdiction. So this, along with a long-term strategic approach on technical and scientific cooperation and capacity building, were some of the issues discussed during SBSTA 23, as well as wildlife management, which is also an issue, particularly in Africa, where urbanization is one of the major action points, the nexus points, if we want, in terms of how you can manage wildlife in a sustainable way as cities expand into natural areas. What was also interesting, and this was not part of Substa, but it was a meeting that happened just before, is that the two co-chairs of the convention's open-ended working group for the production of the post-2020 global biodiversity framework, they had a meeting in which they explained their view of what the post-2020 10-year-long framework for the convention to work should look like. And so it was quite interesting. There are goals for 2050, which in fact reflect the one that is already adopted, but there is a goal for 2030. There are many elements defining responsibility of the parties and the need for transparency. There is a rich discussion about tools and solutions that includes laws, regulations, policies, economics and incentives, and actually behavior change as well. But then there are elements about reducing threats such as climate change or the loss of habitat or pollution or overexploitation. There are elements about meeting people's needs, where we put the benefit sharing. And there is a rich discussion about what should be in the post-2020 framework regarding means of implementation and enabling conditions for the parties to operate. And that includes resource mobilization and capacity building and technology transfer, but also the issues related to traditional knowledge. All of those, by the way, are very important to subnational and local governments and regional governments. And I think what we're seeing is also a stronger participation of these levels of government. It seems very clear in the open-ended working group that, and by the way, also in the long-term approach on mainstreaming, that there will be a lot more emphasis on vertical harmonization of policies and programs. The Substa also looked into the scientific evidence that could be the base for the post-2020 framework, and it had a number of comments. There is a document that is available publicly. It is called the Legal Document 8 of Substa 23, so it's L8 Substa 23. You will find under that name that is on the screen. And it provides some suggestions to the co-chairs of the open-ended working group on how to take science issues on points like habitat loss, overexploitation, pollution, and so on. If you can change the slide, please. So in terms of what is coming next within the convention, as I mentioned, there is a long-term approach to mainstreaming as well, in which ICLEI has a representative. In fact, it's Ingrid who will speak in a few minutes. And this informal advisory group, which is composed of 15 parties and 15 organizations, is helping us develop a long-term approach that will, as I just mentioned, incorporate vertical harmonization. And it will also mention sustainable cities as one of the issues raised in the IPBES Nexus approach. There's a lot of emphasis on sustainable consumption and production, which is very relevant to this constituency. And the idea now is that the long-term approach will be submitted to the co-chairs of the open-ended working group for the post-2020 in time for the second meeting of this group, which will happen in February in China, in Kunming. I want to note that Regions 4 is one of the participants in an extended network that will look into this long-term approach, and we have a call next Tuesday at 9 a.m. Montreal time. The network is open, so if anyone hearing or listening in would like to contribute or participate, that is a possibility. This informal advisory group may meet in late January, early February. We're waiting for a confirmation of that. If not, then the long-term approach will be brought to the subsidiary body on implementation of the convention, which will meet in Montreal in May of 2020. I just want to also put on your radar the second meeting, the Scotland meeting. There is a meeting in Edinburgh offered by the government of Scotland in cooperation with ICLEI and Regions 4 and the group of leading subnational governments for the Aichi biodiversity targets and the European Union Committee of the Regions. They are all collaborating for what is a partnership meeting to the process of the open-ended working group, and they will meet in April in Edinburgh. ICLEI has been circulating with the support and comments of all those groups that I just mentioned, a 10-point position paper, which we hope will be shown at the third meeting of the open-ended working group, which will happen in July in Cali, in Colombia. And I just want to conclude by saying that from the perspective of us in the Secretariat, the plan of action that is currently it's happening, it's being applied, and it was adopted at COP10 of the convention. It's the only multilateral agreement to have such a decision that is operative. So it's very important for this constituency to encourage the parties to the convention to actually review and reposition themselves towards that plan of action, because its proposed duration it ends in 2020. So if the post-2020 framework should consider a strong role for subnational, regional, or local governments, it needs to put in some wording related to how the plan of action is going to be improved, or just reiterated, and how, for instance, the 10 points or others that are in ICLEI's and these networks position paper should be considered in an actual decision. So thank you very much for this occasion, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you very much, Oliver. Just a reminder to participants to keep questions and discussions points for Oliver after the last presentation. There'll be an opportunity to ask questions. I'm now going to hand over to Ingrid Kulsia, who's going to give us a local and subnational perspective.
Thank you very much, Ryan. I'm going to talk about a few events that local and subnational governments were involved at SABSTA. The first was a side event specifically on local and subnational governments taking action. And the focus of this side event was on how actors within these levels of government are using nature-based solutions to address biodiversity and climate challenges. I think we're all very aware of the fact that we are globally facing two crises. And there's a lot that's happening at the city and subnational level to address these crises through very innovative nature-based solutions that are being applied at a local level. Now, the side event was organized by ICLEI, Regions 4, the Advisory Committee on Subnational Governments, the group of leading subnational governments towards Aichi biodiversity targets. And it was moderated by Didier Babin from the Expertise France, with whom ICLEI has a partnership, and we're working with them in supporting post-2020 initiatives amongst the local and subnational government constituency. It was very well attended by a wide range of actors. And if we look at the sort of how it was outlined, it was quite an interesting approach to a side event. It started off by having very short, very punchy presentations. And then the focus of the side event was actually to turn the focus into, or the discussions into, an interaction between the presenters and then representatives from the CBD parties whom we'd invited to attend the side event. And they were asked by the moderators some very specific questions around climate, biodiversity, local and subnational government action. And we had a presentation from the Executive Director, Yushi Shaki, from the Aichi Prefecture. I talked about work that we're doing in Africa under the Swede Bio-funded project called UNA. We had Inaki Sasat from the Regions 4 talking about how successful they've been in terms of mainstreaming biodiversity at subnational level. And we had a representative from the government of Quebec talking about biodiversity monitoring and conservation tools. And through the discussions, we identified or highlighted a series of sort of common themes or common issues and issues. Basically, the one was that across the globe you have very different sorts of solutions and innovations, but essentially all using nature as the main way of addressing challenges related to climate and to ecological deterioration. We also looked at or agreed that in order for the post-2020 biodiversity framework to be effective, it needs the input and the contributions from the lower levels of government, particularly insofar as implementation is concerned. There was a general reaffirmation of the link between nature-based solutions, biodiversity and climate, particularly at the subnational levels, where the policies that are made at national and even in the international arena impact very tangibly and concretely on people's daily lives. And I think, in a sense, a comment that was made by Wendy Yap, who was representing Singapore at the side event, really summed up nicely what the sort of interface between nature and biodiversity is about. And she was saying that in Singapore, biodiversity and nature are as important as infrastructure in urban governance. So if you move to the next slide, I want to just talk briefly about the second side event. And that was one that had been organized by Expertise France, and it focused specifically on policy messages from science and policy in relation to transformational change. And they had gathered very wide perspectives. We had Ana Maria Hernandez, who's the chairman or chairperson of IPBES, representing the scientific fraternity and the IPBES position. Marina Weissenberg from Finland was there, as well as Takafumi Osawa from Japan. And those were sort of, they both represented CBD party perspectives. Myself, representing ICLEI, was talking about the perspective from local and subnational government sort of lens, and then Alexandra Rankovic from IDDR, also again from the more academic research side of things. And it was a very lively side event. There were around 100 people who attended it. A lot of discussion, a lot of very interesting things, you know, looking at what are the challenges, what are the issues, how we can resolve these things. And from the local perspective, one of the discussion points that came out was the need to increase and improve the understanding of how biodiversity policies that depend on implementation at local levels, and to recognize that there's a lot that's already being done, a lot of practical methodologies, good practices, etc., which could be scaled up and scaled out across the rest of the world. So one of the other things that I wanted to just talk about briefly was actually an event that took place outside of SAPSTA a few days before. It was held from the 21st to the 22nd of November, and it was organized by the Secretariat of the convention. And it was specifically around communications of post-2020. They gathered a group of almost 50 experts from various institutions like the World Bank, IUCN, the Global Youth Biodiversity Network, WWF, ICLEI, UNEP, the other related conventions like CITES, etc., to talk about how to package the various messages that are coming out from the process leading up to COP15, but also going beyond that, and essentially, you know, what's the sort of strategy in terms of communication, both from the convention side, but also from all of the other organizations like our own, ICLEI, but also IUCN, etc., that work in this field of or this biodiversity space. So the sort of key outcomes of that was that instead of trying to force people to go to a particular approach, we opted for a flotilla approach, but that we come with a common understanding of the key messages and what the priorities are, and that the flotilla needs to be well coordinated. So the IUCN and the WWF and the National Geographic and World Bank and everybody's efforts are coordinated and head towards the same sort of goalposts. We also talked about a messaging matrix, which deals both on the one side with the advocacy messages, but on the other side also, very importantly, the public awareness. So the people out there, the ordinary people, people that don't deal with the convention on a day-to-day basis, can understand what's going on and why it's important. We developed a whole calendar of events, and we talked about branding. And then just finally, the last thing that I want to talk about this afternoon is an event that was organized by Mayor Valerie Plante and hosted by her. She's the mayor of Montreal, and she is the ICLEI's global ambassador for local biodiversity. And what she did was to invite a number of parties, CBD parties, to her City Hall for an engagement between the constituency of local and subnational governments and the parties. It took place on Tuesday afternoon, 26th, and it was discussing, the purpose was to discuss the role and contribution of the local and subnational government group, also to introduce the 10-point framework that Oliver referred to earlier, and then to hear from the parties what their views were and what their ambitions were and how they saw the role and contribution of local and subnational governments. And it was a really amazing event. It was a relatively small event, but it was very important. And the great news is that she managed, the mayor managed to draw both the co-chairs away from SABSTA, the co-chairs of the open-ended working group. They attended the meeting, as well as 7 other parties that were represented there. And then there was representation from local and subnational governments. And then just briefly to point out, or just to highlight the 10 points in the 10-point framework. Essentially what this does is to call upon parties to acknowledge that local and subnational governments are part and parcel of government and essential in designing, committing and implementing the new global biodiversity framework. In the second point, to unlock resource mobilization to increase funding for biodiversity and nature-based solutions. Thirdly, to create enabling environments for significantly increased private sector investment. Fourthly, to ensure that the current nature trajectory of biodiversity loss is recognized as a global priority, and that we need education, communication and public awareness initiatives to reach the people in and around our cities. Fifthly, to create an enabling environment that supports the mainstreaming of the multiple social and health benefits of nature at the local and subnational levels. In the sixth place, to foster the interconnections between the different global agendas in a systematic and synergistic way. In the seventh place, to promote the co-production of data, but also better access to data and scientific evidence at the local and subnational levels. And the eighth point is about creating an enabling environment to support changes in lifestyle and consumption, which is something that can be achieved very successfully at the lower levels of government. Then the ninth one is to support the Cities with Nature commitment and reporting mechanism. And finally, the 10th point is that it relates back to the point Oliver made earlier, is that we need to have a legacy for the plan of action for cities and subnational levels of government, and that all of the 9 previous points need to be captured in that 10 point. So this was all very well received, and one of the outcomes was that the parties felt that supported the mayor's call to have Friends of Cities and Subnational Governments, and we will be meeting again at the February open-ended working group. And then just lastly, just to make the point that she also just explained to everybody present that ICLEI is the focal point under the Global Task Force of Local and Regional Governments in relation to specifically the Rio Conventions. And with that, I think that's enough for me, and we can hand over to our organizers. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ingrid. We'll now listen to a recording from Ms. Wendy Yap from Singapore, who just shared some reflections on Mayor Plan's roundtable. So just bear with us. This was recorded this morning, so we're not able to engage with her directly, but some good insights from Wendy this morning.
Thank you, Ingrid. Thank you, everyone. I participated in this roundtable. Sorry, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Yes, Wendy.
Yeah. Okay, good. I think it was a very valuable roundtable that was organized by the Mayor of Montreal, primarily because we had the full attention of both the OEWG chairs that were there full time. And I think we highlighted the role that cities could potentially contribute in terms of the global post-2020 framework. And as mentioned by Ingrid, we highlighted the ICLEI 10-point framework, and I think that was well delivered. But we wanted to actually explore with the two OEWG chairs on what possibility could cities contribute, and there were some discussions on how we can contribute to the discussions. I think they are very keen for cities to take part in it, but I think it's now dependent on the modalities and how we come up with maybe bold declarations to commit cities to implementing the post-2020 framework, or we have to come up with some textual proposals when we see the draft coming up for OEWG2 on how we can integrate cities' contribution to the post-2020 framework. I think there was also appreciation to the Scottish government who are organizing, who will be organizing a thematic workshop in April on subnational and regional governments, and this gives us another opportunity to explore how cities and subnational governments can contribute to the post-2020 framework. At this point, I also like to highlight that Singapore, we basically had a workshop in October 2019 this year to review the City Biodiversity Index, or also known as the Singapore Index on Cities Biodiversity, which could potentially be a tool to help cities demonstrate their commitment to a post-2020 framework. So the workshop in October actually reviewed the existing suite of 23 indicators and also explored potentially 7 new indicators to be included, which actually will highlight the developments in the last 10 years, primarily on habitat restoration, biodiversity and health, nature-based solutions, vertical greenery, citizen science, natural capital assessments. So these are some of the new indicators that are being discussed. And then about 3 indicators that have been dropped from the old one. We are planning to actually have the revised set of indicators, aim to have it sometime in March 2020, and we hope to circulate this to all interested parties. So if you're interested to know more about this, do write to me and I can send you the current discussions, and you can also provide your feedback. So back to Mayor Plan's roundtable, I'd like to say that it was a great opportunity to have the full attention of the 2 OEWG chairs, and I think they recognize the city's contribution. Now is for us to act and to see how we can actually concretely put cities' contribution into the post-2020 global framework. I will end there. Thank you.
We thank Wendy in her absence. Some good insights and some important dates to note for 2020. So I'm going to hand over to our last speaker for the session, Ms. Larissa Heinisch.
Thank you.
From the preparatory workshop. Over to you, Larissa.
Thank you, Ryan. Also, thank you, Oliver, Ingrid, and Wendy for your previous presentations. I'm gonna bring the summary of the preparatory workshop on local approaches to ecosystems restoration governance. This event was held in Rio de Janeiro, in Brazil, in the Museum of Environment in the Botanic Garden. It occurred during 2 days, on the 4th and the 5th of November of this year. And it was a preparatory workshop prior to the Convention on Biological Diversity Restoration workshop, also organized in Rio from the 6th to the 8th of November, so on the following days. The context for this event was on the preparation, of course, for the COP15 of CDBs, and had a really strong focus on restoration based on the UN Decade on Ecosystem Restoration that was published in March this year, and that's will be a strong agenda for us to look on the following year. The event was organized by the Post-2020 Biodiversity Framework, EU support, funded by the EU and implemented by Expertise France. Next, please. So the key objective of the event was to showcase the contribution from different perspectives, so from local actors to private sector and non-state actors on restoration initiatives, and provide inspirational material in terms of restoration governance for the post-2020 biodiversity framework. So the objective of the event was to collect ambitions and leave the event with these ambitions stated, also for the following days, but also on this roadmap. So in terms of attendees, it was approximately 100 participants and 15 panelists. It's important to just mention that I'm speaking on behalf of Marina Briant, which was our representation in this event. So I'm bringing here some summary based on her inputs and her perspective from the event as well. I listed below some key organizations that took part on the event. So as I mentioned, ICLEI was represented through my colleague Marina, also the International Institute of Sustainability of the PUC Rio, which is the Pontifice Catholic University of Rio, UN Biodiversity from the CBD, the European Union delegation to Brazil, World Resource Institute Brazil, and the European Commission, to just highlight some key ones. I bring here the overview of the program. So it was the open session and had 5 thematic sessions, and which I list here, which were ambitions for restoration in the post-2020 biodiversity framework. The second one, which was on local and subnational governments' contribution to restoration, and on this one was the one we took part at, together with representatives from the cities of Extrema, Campinas, Palmas, also the organization Corredor Ecológico do Vale do Paraíba, following 3 more sessions on private sector's contribution to restoration, non-state actors' contribution to restoration, and policy proposal on restoration, group of 4. Next, please. So the main output, the main document of the event was a report that listed 11 findings during this discussion, which I'm bringing here, and I'm going to comment on some of them. So the first finding was that subnational governments and local actors, non-governmental organizations, and private sector play an instrumental role in the implementation of ecosystem restoration. So really reinforcing, bringing different perspectives and different type of actors, and very importantly, the statement that subnational and local networks for implementation should be empowered. So here a point of attention for us at ICLEI as this important structure to reinforce the restoration process. Secondly, ecosystem restoration needs to balance biodiversity conservation and provision of ecosystem service to maintain human well-being. And this is really important when talking also about the different methodologies existing on evaluating an ecosystem service and how we value those as a point of attention in the discussions by the local government as well, that support for that methodological view on how to analyze that's really important. Thirdly, ecosystem restoration aims to restore biodiversity in the whole range of ecosystems functions and service. Restoration actions should promote approaches focused on the recovery of ecological processes such as remodeling and open-ended restoration. Next, please. The fourth point brought about how ecosystem restoration is also very important for addressing climate change and contributes to job creation, poverty alleviation, and provides business opportunities. And here I reinforce also an important point of discussion during the event, which was how the restoration thematic, but the biodiversity agenda as a whole should be really connected with other agendas, which is also a point in our 10 points framework, which was also mentioned on the previous presentation. So how we foster the interconnectedness with other global agendas through a systematic approach. So really looking at restoration as an adaptation and mitigation measure on addressing climate change. The fifth point was regarding national policies. So national policies are in place to reduce and counterbalance all ecosystems degradation and prioritize restoration programs established to reduce X amount of the degradation of already degraded systems. So when fully implemented, this together will provide net positive impacts for ecosystems. The sixth point was on resource mobilization mechanism that should include bottom-up approach, which build ownership and participatory engagement. So really looking at different types of actors that can contribute on bringing resource to restoration, which is a costly measurement sometimes. So was also mentioned how state governance and local governments should really build forces as well to scale up restoration approaches in order also to bring together financial and human resources to scale up these initiatives. The seventh point was in assigning funds designated to restoration for capacity building, education, communication, and the promotion of ecosystem restorations as the benefits for society. And this one also is important because in terms of communicating in a very clear way based on technical information, the benefits from promoting restoration approach, and as a way also to bring sensibilize some sectors and bringing awareness and interest on investing on restoration approach. So the contribution and the possibilities of joint forces with the private sectors was also a point really reinforced during this event. So how we have a robust methodology to have a solid analysis and how to communicate the benefits of restoration and ecosystem service, and on that way bringing resources and fundings and considering targeting the private sector as well. The final 4 points were on restoration targets can be measured in terms of ecosystem condition, pressures, and direct and indirect drivers. The ninth, effective monitoring needs to be guaranteed, which require resources and open data. So that's something I already mentioned on the previous point, that restoration sometimes can be have costs for the local governments that require joint forces on financial and human types of contributions to monitor. So this needs to be considered in a long term on drawing also projects and programs and proposals on restoration. So not only monitoring at the start and on the process, but also really thinking on a long-term monitoring that can really quantify the impacts of the restoration intervention. 10th, for ecosystem restoration in areas where indigenous people and local communities live, there shall be a free and prior informed consent. They shall be part of restoration efforts, also building on their traditional knowledge and innovations and practice. And finally, ecosystem restorations carried out in urban and rural areas considering their specificities. That was something that especially on our session on local governance, it was really reinforced by the local governments that we need to look at the specificities and how restoration needs to be different depending on our area, if it's urban or rural. My last slide, I just listed here some useful resources and links based on some documents that mentioned during my presentation. The first two ones are the publication of the event on the post-2020 website. The second one is the full agenda, if you're interested in knowing more about the other speakers, and some materials from the UN environment from the restoration decade, and also the CBD decisions on the COP13. And finally, the last one is a link on Brazilian diagnosis regarding biodiversity and ecosystem service, and some figures on how interventions like restoration can really support a sustainable economy. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Larissa, Ingrid, Wendy in her absence, and Oliver for these amazing presentations. As I mentioned before we started, we'll now have an opportunity for participants to ask a question, make comments, and please make use of the raising your hand function, or you can use the chat or questions functions if you so prefer. I don't see any hands raised at the moment. No
Right.
questions. Hi, Oliver.
Yes, I just wanted to make two comments if it's appropriate.
Indeed.
Yeah, so I really enjoyed the presentations overall. I learned, and I just had two kind of things that came to my mind. First, even though Wendy is not on the call, I thought her presentation was very good, and because I was also with Ingrid part of the team that was at the Singapore workshop, I thought her positioning that infrastructure is as important as nature in Singapore is really unique in the world. And more than that, I think what struck me in Singapore is, of course, that we need to provoke them further. So Singapore is so far advanced in terms of integrating nature around infrastructure that, of course, we are tempted to challenge them to go beyond. And I think when we read articles like in National Geographic of what is next for the cities, how can cities really incorporate those 300 million Chinese that need to get urbanized from here to 2050, how are we going to achieve that? I think the next challenge in Singapore is to really imbricate nature and infrastructure together. We need to merge those two. The idea of a sponge city could be complexified in the city as an ecosystem, and the infrastructure, this is the next challenge, as part of this ecosystem. So that's one comment. The other one is just that Larissa's points, and I think the workshop in Rio was particularly useful because it preceded an official consultation towards the post-2020 framework. And I think once again, as I had mentioned, in sustainable wildlife management, it is very clear that there is no progress without subnational and local action. I think it's becoming clear that in restoration, there's also no progress without the complete and integral participation of subnational and local governments. And so my point here is that there is an overarching principle in the convention, and it's called the ecosystem approach, that proposes that management and resources need to be focused on the level, geographically and spatially and scale, where it will bring about the biggest change. And what the parties are realizing is that a lot of the levers for action in restoration, in sustainable use of natural resources like in fisheries, where the quotas are normally fixed at subnational level, but also in terms of connectivity, in terms of carbon offsets, and even I would say in terms of incentives. A lot of the dealing with business sectors is done at subnational and local level. So I hope that when we can use the ecosystem approach, which is already a part of the convention's toolbox, and it is a central part, to make parties understand that there is wording in this approach that actually allows a much closer look at how the post-2020 can engage at the subnational and local level. Thank you.
Oliver, I think that's great, and I've made a note of that. I mean, I think there's so much richness in the convention and the many decisions. One sometimes tends to forget that, but I think that that's a really important detail, particularly also in that it should underpin a lot of what we're saying in the 10-point framework, because a lot of those things are actually ways in which that principle can be operationalized, as it were. So
in fact, what you could do, what one could do, is to, in the next version of the 10-point framework, which I think contains the elements that parties should be looking at when they review the plan of action, there could be mention in, because you already have one of the points there is managed at the landscape and seascape level.
Yes.
And this of managing sea and landscapes is coming up across the entire range of comments for the post-2020. So I think that's where probably a mention to the ecosystem approach and principle 12, if I'm not mistaken, but correct me later, it says
I think
management needs to be decentralized, governance needs to be decentralized at the most effective level.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. I have a question for Larissa, if there's nothing else, nobody else asking questions or wanting to make comments.
Doesn't look like it. We have a few minutes left, so go ahead.
Larissa, in your presentation, you referred to the last session being on policy principles or policy proposals, sorry, for restoration. Was there a sort of a statement, workshop statement that came out, or is this just going to be something that will be captured in the report that you also referred to?
Hi. So this policy proposal restoration group was finalized with a report back to the plenary, but I need to check if this is integrated fully on the 10 points I brought to you. I think that contributes to the overall 11 findings I said, but I'm not sure if there was any specific document on that.
Okay, thanks so much.
Mm-hmm. And also thank you for the other contributions. Really, Oliver's comment on the ecosystem approach really reinforces some of the key points discussed during the workshop. And yeah, it's very important that we integrate the principles and the perspectives on our route to the next COP.
Thanks, Larissa. I don't see any other hands raised or questions or comments made from attendees. We are just out of time. So unless there's anything else from the panelists, any attendees, doesn't look like it. I think we can call the webinar to a close. Just a reminder that presentations and the recording of the webinar will be made available to attendees, so you can expect to receive that shortly. And yeah, once again, just thank you to everyone for availing yourself to participate. So special thanks to our panelists, Oliver, Larissa, and Wendy in their absence. We know for Oliver and Larissa, it's obviously a bit early in the morning. We really do appreciate your time and effort. And I think with that, I'll close the webinar. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you a lot.
Yes.